When looking at the state of the world today, it can feel like everything is falling apart. We're living in a moment of rupture. Structures are crumbling, and people feel more divided than ever. But what if rupture isn't the end of the story, but the beginning? What if it's from those very fissures and fault lines that something new is trying to emerge? That's why I was so excited to talk with philosopher Bayo Akomolafe for this week's episode. Because it's in those fractures where his work resides. He investigates the promise and possibility that rupture holds. My name is Willow Defebaugh, and this is The Nature of. Each week, we'll look to the natural world for insights into how to navigate the experience of being human. This week, we're exploring the nature of emergence. Emergence is the phenomenon of complex natural systems arising organically. For example, a forest isn't born out of a specific plan. It emerges from seeds sprouting in fertile soil, responding to conditions around them. From there, plants and trees grow, attracting pollinators and animals that disperse nutrients, fungi forming networks below the ground. Before you know it, an entirely new world is born. Bayo invites us to see ourselves as part of that intricate web of emergence. He's one of the most brilliant minds I know, and every time we speak, I'm left with a perspective shift. So, you can expect our conversation to get a little philosophical, but stick with us because I promise what you'll get from it is worth it. Bayo, it is such a pleasure to reconnect with you almost a year after our last talk, which is hard to believe. But I'm really particularly excited to speak with you today about the nature of emergence. It's something that you often speak about in your work, and I'm wondering if we can ground this conversation by you sharing your own definition of emergence, as well as maybe a moment in your life where emergence really revealed itself to you.
Well, Willow, it is always a delight and pleasure to be in conversation with you. I still haven't recovered from that one. I don't know that I have a readily available definition of emergence. I usually shy away from the definitional. But I would probably say that emergence complicates notions, steady liberal humanist notions of agency, of accountability, of intention, of choice. And these are not trivial matters at all. These are ways that we, citizens gestating in white modernity, have been trained and habituated into thinking about ourselves in relation to the world around us. It's how we think about the future, how we think about responding to genocide. It's how we think about our roles in the Anthropocene. It's a story, the story behind the story that we tell ourselves about how everything moves. The account of emergence, I think, when I say it complicates these liberal humanist ideas, it's my way of saying that we can no longer afford the luxury of believing we are the movers of the world. That we here is the human, beavers and elephants and microbes and lichen and mycelia, everything moves the world, and that makes it incredibly difficult but utterly awe-inspiring to think about what agency is doing. Emergence might very well be how the world meets itself, how knowing cannot be reduced to fact, how science has always been political, how technology is not the thing that we control, rather it is the thing that we are co-emergent with. And I know that is using double definitions, but I mean by that we are not in control of technology. I don't even know to speak about creating technology. I think in the self-same moment we create our tools create us.
Bayo, one of my favorite things about speaking with you is that you are such a gifted storyteller, in addition to the wisdom that you hold. So I'm wondering, as we kick off this conversation about emergence, do you have a story for us to help illustrate this concept?
There's several examples that jump to mind, each salacious. Let me cite a simple example, one that is dear to me. I've been traveling, and I usually come back with a bag full of gifts from people who hear me speak and then generously give their gifts. Someone gave me a puzzle piece set. It had pieces shaped like the Tetris game, and of course the aim of every puzzle is to piece things together in the ways that the manufacturer has predetermined that they should be pieced together. I came back with that piece and I gave it to my son, for whom it was meant. And my son took the puzzle piece and started to dismantle it. He doesn't usually say thank you. He's autistic, I should say. He doesn't say thank you. He has no time for all those neurotypical conventions. He took it from me and went down to business. I left him for a bit. I came back and he had his hand outstretched. Willow, have I told you this story before?
No.
Oh, he had his hand outstretched and he had in his small fist a few despondent pieces of that puzzle. And he said, Dada, could you throw this away from me? Which worried me. I was like, that's not exactly how puzzles work. The aim, my dear son, is to put all the pieces back together again. You would be akin to a surgeon performing surgery and throwing out organs just to get to the heart or something like, oh, this is just in the way. I tried to explain that to him. He wasn't budging. So he insisted. And so I took it and I pretended like I was throwing it away. I was discarding the pieces, but I put them in my pocket. And then I moved closer to what he was doing and noticed, to my great, surprise, that he was arranging the pieces according to their similarity, not according to how they fit, to some manufacturer's predetermined model. So the sevens, each in blue, yellow, green, the sevens were arranged in a linear progression. The other pieces were arranged in another progression. And of course, when you do the puzzle that way, it takes up more space than it needs to. But then in that moment, I realized that there were two autisms at work. One was my son's autism, and the other was my autism, except that I spell mine OUGHTISM, that it ought to be this way, that it ought to work out this way. I was invested in the manufacturer's vision for how the puzzle should work. And my son was playing with the world differently and disarranging and disrupting and dissing the purpose of things. And maybe that's my story, and I have 100 of them, of how other kinds of agencies spill through the purpose or the functionality or the instrumentality or the utility of a thing. And it's only autistic perception, that is my son's perception, that knows how to notice emergence in that way. Right? Yeah, I think I'll stop there.
I really cherish every time you share a story about your family, because I learn so much, and I can only imagine how much you learn every day. It's beautiful.
Thank you, sister.
The puzzle story brings up for me strategy. We live in this world that is so dominated by strategy. We have to think our way out of every puzzle, every problem. And emergence offers this other invitation, which is how might things perhaps naturally want to coalesce or converge. I want to pull at something you said, which was we have to move at the pace of the world.
Yes.
And to me, it's so clear how, in a way, strategy is in opposition to that, because strategy is trying to get ahead of the world. It's trying to always be in the future, never here, never present to what is emerging. And I also love that you brought in this notion of emergence or entanglement isn't just this reductive idea of we're all one. Okay, great, our work is done, we can stop. It's actually, because that does a disservice to what emergence is really honoring, which is how deeply complex of a world we are entangled in. It's acknowledging and it's honoring that complexity and the grooves that emerge.
Yes.
I wanted to, slowing down, moving at the pace of the world is something that we've spoken about a few times. And I wanted to ask you, in a world that feels like there is so much urgency, where there are all of these compounding crises, what emerges when we actually allow ourselves to slow down?
So this is something that I should confess, Willow, but don't share it with anyone, okay? This is just between you and I.
Okay.
I love cartoons. And I love, beautiful animation. I do a lot of good thinking with that filmic exploration. There's something animation can do that live action can't do. So I love animation. There's one I started to watch recently called Common Side Effects.
Okay.
It's on HBO Max. It's amazing. It's beautiful. I will spoil it because I'm Nigerian. Just a brief spoiling here. It is about a mushroom called the blue angel mushroom that heals everything. Just a little shake of its dust in the mouth of a beheaded pigeon can actually reanimate dead objects or sick people or people suffering from dementia, right? Except the pharmaceutical industrial complex does not want this to come out because they're invested in keeping people well, you see.
Sure.
And this wellness that this blue angel mushroom offers is a disruptive kind of wellness, which cannot be monetized, at least at the moment. And so they chase this protagonist who has a few pieces of this incredibly rare, hallucinogenic, and medical mushroom. In episode 3, that's how into it I am. In episode 3, the protagonist is trying to grow these mushrooms because he's run out of his supply, and he's trying to raise these mushrooms in his backyard. He of course salvaged the field that he found near a giant pharmaceutical factory, which was the runoff, the spillage was toxifying and poisoning the entire environment. And so he salvaged the pieces he found, and he was trying to raise these pieces or new pieces of this mushroom in a pure environment. I will skip to the chase, where he realizes that it's not that the mushrooms were grown in spite of the spillage. It's that they were feeding on the spillage, on the poison, right? And it changes everything. I remember just immediately grabbing my journal and just writing in it Weird Fidelities, which is in part the subject of my new book.
Weird Fidelities.
By Weird Fidelities, right? Modernity really teaches us to think in terms of binaries. Left, right, good, bad, fidelity, infidelity, stuff like that, right? I wonder about the tensions between where the very enactment of purity creates the conditions for contaminants to thrive, right? That sometimes in sterile environments, in utopia, the very conditions for dystopia might emerge, right? It could be a mushroom sprouting in Chernobyl. It could be the devil sprouting in Eden, in the Garden of Eden. So imagine well-intentioned activists in this animation, in this cartoon, doing their darndest to tear down that wall, Gorbachev style, to tear down that pharmaceutical complex, to say, we don't want this spillage any longer. They would be acting at odds with the very thing that could actually release them from entrapment, from incarceration within that complex. So maybe that's my idea here. There's a way that white modernity works where it can actually enlist the adversary, the countercultural project, the protester. It can enlist the infrapolitics into its workings so that the virus and the antivirus maintain the same thing, right? And so I'm invested in a third way, right? This weird fidelity issue, climbing aboard the slave ship and sailing into the wound of the transatlantic slave trade, not seeking victory, not eschewing defeat, but noticing that something about transversely crossing the Atlantic in a way that does not guarantee solutions opens up new spaces of power. I realize I may have traipsed off far off the question that you asked.
Well, you traipsed off into at least 3 other questions I wanted to ask you, which we will all get to.
It's the psychic traipsing off.
But the one I'll start with is the third way, because this framework, this non-binary thinking, could not be more relevant for the world that we're living in today, where it feels like binaries are everywhere and polarity is at an extreme. And it's interesting that you bring up the case of, well, first of all, I'm very excited to watch this show, and everyone listening has homework. But
common side effects, people.
Common side effects. It reminds me first of, we've done stories on a few different ecotopias and the kind of shadow sides that ended up emerging within utopia. And I always think about that, of what is it about trying to develop a place that's rooted in good or perfection or whatever else that inevitably brings about the seeds of its opposite that is part of what created it in the first place. I'm very interested in that train of thought, but where it leads me is, how do we practice rising above the binary? How do we practice the third way in our everyday lives, stepping outside of the binary, especially in these times of extreme polarity?
I'll offer something that will shock us away from the economy of that question.
Okay.
I don't think that we can. I don't think it's left to us. I don't think it's a skill to develop, right? I think to live, to exist, is to be defeated over and over again. That is, we are the frothing edge of an explosion that is still happening, that we rudely call reality or space-time or whatever you want to call it, or God, right? This panentheistic procession of orgasmic possibilities that is branching out diffractively in a way that we will never be able to control.
I want to come back to what you shared around post-activism, because I think this idea that we're always entangled with, or how we respond to crisis is part of the crisis, right? Or I think you've said in the past, we are entangled with that which we resist too. We are what we resist. And I'm curious if you can speak to how we engage with, how do we hold post-activism, and how do we engage with injustice at the same time in a way that honors identity or complexity, but also doesn't fall into, I guess, the traps of activist ideas of the past.
Right. Well, you see what's happening in the United States today. Probably you more than myself, an occasional visitor to the United States, is upon Trump's second assumption of power, there seems to have been this dramatic culture shift, right? Even Mark Zuckerberg gave this tech bro speech where he says it seems culture is shifting. And all of a sudden, everything that progressives have worked hard to install as part of mainstream culture is fading away, is losing its value. DEI, psh, LGBTQ, who cares, right? It's that philanthropic organizations are now stripping themselves and their websites off these things. They're purging. And so it seems like this about face, this shocking thing has happened. And I wonder about that. What I particularly wonder about is how morality works. And by morality, I don't mean a stable structure. I mean something dynamic, rendered visible by legislation or laws or unspoken rules about behavior or stuff like that. But how morality as an ontological, epistemological force shapes what is possible, right? And how logics are maintained even in the face of damning dramatic cultural shifts like the United States is experiencing right now. It's the pendulum. It's swishing or moving from left to right. And you might say, oh, this is dramatic. But no, the pendulum as this dome-like structure or relational, processual, dynamic structure that is moving and responsive maintains a logic. It maintains bodies in a particular way. In the same way, sister, I wonder about justice too, and how the very enactment of justice, the ethnography of justice, maintains injustice, right? That's something about how justice works, makes injustice possible. So I speak about post-activism as a kind of opening, as an eruptive moment, as a crack that disrupts the ongoing continuity of this vocation of, oh, we're going to pull down that power. Oh, now it's the left's turn to be outraged. Oh, it's the right's turn to be outraged. I'm blasting out of the entire game without transcending the game, but blasting out of it and noticing that this is indeed a game. The pendulum is moving from left to right, and we're constantly trying to pull it to our side, but the logic is maintained. Are there other ways of framing and embodying lives and futures that does not cohere with this game that we're entrapped in? That is the vocation of what I call parapolitics, which is a cultivation of different modes of perception that might allow us to visit and be visited by the world that we're trying to resolve. The third way is not a third thing in the numerological or numerical sense, but it's a transversal cutting open of the failure of a binary, right? It's when binaries fail to produce novel things, new kinds of things. And when that happens, a new space of politics has opened up. It's a different question than what that politics consists of.
Well, and I think that's very much where we are, because I think, being here in the United States in this pendulum swing, that's exactly what it feels like, which is, okay, so are we going to spend the next 4 years trying to figure out how to survive this? And then once we have a Democrat back in office, then we'll try to re-implement all of these policies, everything we work for. And then after 4 years of that, they'll all get torn down again, something has to shift. For me, a lot of my curiosity is around what are the responses that feel like, to come back to a word you I think often use, is rupture. Like, what are the responses that feel like they're breaking through that binary? That brave and wonderful bishop who spoke to Trump and said, remember our humanity. That was a moment, remember mercy. That was this moment that felt like it cut through to me. And so I'm interested in these moments that disrupt the pendulum.
I enjoy that speech as well. Maybe what feels interesting to me is a politics that does not have a solution. Morality works by justification. It seeks to settle the unsettled, right? And it's a form of care, right? But I think sidling these energies are a different fugitive notion of care, a care that isn't quite itself yet, but is along the way to becoming itself, right? It's so fine and so subtle. It could be the Shell CEO who's just about to write another check, allowing the Niger Delta to sink deeper into toxic poison, right? But something catches the pen, and there's this liminal space between the pen and the checkbook, right? But then he proceeds. I'm very much aware and alive to those tiny, unnameable moments and what they are calling us into. So something about what I speak about cracks are always speculative, might involve a little bit of magical realism, inviting us to story the world differently, to gather in puddles, to read together, to eat together, to cook together. It may not look like a temple, but it sure looks to me like it's a work of making sanctuary. And this sanctuary project is not about keeping ourselves safe and legible. It's about making sanctuary for that tiny thing, sister, that I call a crack. That infra-thin feeling, that notion of I'm exhausted with being good, that catches us, that we can build an altar around. Where does that take us? I don't know. Should this supplement or displace our efforts of fighting the establishment? I don't think so. I don't think it can. I don't think it can ever be mainstream. But the world does not turn on the mainstream. The world emerges with minor gestures written in the minor key. It's not the categorical that makes for change. It's the infinitesimally small. It's the fugitive that makes for change. So, yeah, I'm not sure what that does.
Beautifully put. And we can't really talk about emergence without talking about the unknown and the mystery, because that is a massive part of it. And it's at the risk of creating another binary, I think, with the rise of authoritarianism here and in other places, which is so much about control from a select few amount of people, emergence, which is a surrendering of control and honoring the complexity, vast complexity. There's something in that to me that feels like the answer, and it is not really about arriving at a solution. It is perhaps being more curious about the spaces and the cracks. And that is perhaps the moment that we are living into right now. And I think every day I hear people are asking me, well, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? And perhaps it's that. I was just speaking to someone the other day about this, and I shared that when I feel like there isn't an obvious to do, it's perhaps because there is nothing to do yet. And perhaps that's the pregnant pause that we are in a lot of ways in these current politics.
Isn't that humbling, Willow?
It is.
There's nothing to do yet. It runs against everything we've told ourselves. There's always something to do. Think about the ways we think about that glorious binary, that other binary that is present even now in our conversation. Apathy, agency. It's either you're part of the problem or you're part of the solution. It's either you're doing something or you're hurting those who are doing something. It's such a strict, brittle, and rigid binary that it does not notice. It doesn't know how to notice the tiny inflections, the spillages and leakages, the ways that purity hurts itself, the way that purity is already impure. It doesn't know how to notice those things that mean that the world isn't straight and narrow. The American state started out as a promise, the promise that we can co-enact a regime of governance that is safe enough to try, in which the premise is not getting things done. The promise is what is safe enough that honors every single person as an active agent in determining the shape of our government. What is safe enough to try? I've noticed the new spiel on CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News. The new argument seems to rotate about, well, Trump is getting things done. Well, he's getting things done. Why are you complaining? Why are you liberals complaining? Trump and his boss, Elon Musk, are getting things done. They're getting things done. And I wondered to myself, when was it about getting things done? Because if it was simply about getting things done, then we should just have a monarchy, right? Which tells me again, sister, that the logic of monarchy has always been part of the democratic arrangement. It never really left. Just like the slave ship never really disappeared. It just regurgitated its guts and became the shore. And its hierarchical arrangement of bodies, privileged bodies over black bodies, over natural resources, became transferred into or reinforced the shore, right? The hinterlands, the borderlands. In the same way, America never really got rid of its monarchy, its monarchical origins. Even though it fought against the British Empire, it maintained the logic. Now, those tensions with new technologies, new arrangements, those tensions that were hitherto hidden are simmering to the surface.
I wanted to go back to what you shared around when did the goal become getting things done? Because, I mean, you just summarized America, I think, in in a question. But it also, it occurs to me we're having this conversation pretty much exactly 5 years after the COVID-19 pandemic started, and what that instigated in the world was a disruption in getting things done, right? And we saw so much bubble to the surface during that time. So much, I think, amidst the grief and obviously the loss, there was also so much revelation, I think. And to me, that was so tied to doing nothing, the there is nothing to do feeling that everyone was confronted with. And so I think there is something to that from 5 years ago to think about in this particular moment when perhaps we are not bound by physical containers of isolation, but there is still perhaps nothing to do yet.
Mm-hmm. I agree. There might be nothing to do and yet everything to do. It might be the case that it's not ours to do. It's not ours to do now. But I want to dwell on this idea that maybe the pandemic is also part and parcel of the political moments that the United States specifically is experiencing right now, right? That, this idea of a seed crystal, that there are fundamentally, I guess, two ways that a crystal might form over eons of years in a cave somewhere or in a lab where a supersaturated solution could be inseminated with a seed crystal. And upon doing this, you can immediately crystallize, grow a crystal in a lab. A seed crystal is inserted and it freezes the supersaturated solution and a crystal emerges faster than it would take when it does it naturally in a cave somewhere, I suppose. What seed crystals do is to crystallize tensions that are already within a solution, a supersaturated solution. What I said earlier about a democracy behaving or having those hidden tensions within it of behaving like a monarchy seem very true here, especially when you bring in a pandemic. Maybe the pandemic was the seed crystal that immediately turned politics on its head, or allowed for those hidden tensions to become more solid. And so the tension now became getting things done. Even if it denies us, the very slow-paced, unsexy, procedural, bureaucratic, arguments and conversations that have hitherto seemingly characterized American politics. Now it's who can punch faster, who can hit harder. And that is how the ethical punctuates the moral, how disruption can shape fields of thought and behavior.
I love the analogy of politics has become who can throw the hardest punch or who can throw the punch first. And the reality is no one's questioning why they're in the boxing ring. No one's questioning the rules of the puzzle. And to bring it back to how this conversation started.
Yeah.
And perhaps that's the best role that we can play. Just for my own curiosity, I want to pull out a thread from the very beginning of this conversation, which was you mentioned technology and questioning, do we really develop technology, or is technology developing us? Does it happen in tandem? How, in your eyes, does emergence relate to technology, particularly right now with the onset of AI and this moment we're in?
For a long time, we have been in rich intergenerational conversations about agency, about the creator and the created, and how these binarized ways of thinking about roles in emergence obscure the complexity of emergence. How it is often the case that we are summoned by the created. I often give the example of microchimerism, but it's almost Freudian in its dynamics, right? That biologists notice that cells do not just propagate from the mother holding a child in her womb to the child, but they propagate the other way as well. The child taints or stains the mother with her own cells, right? And some fetal cells have been found in the brains of, nursing mothers, right? Which suggests to me that what Freud was famous for saying, the child has become the father of the man, right? The creator creates the created creates the creator, right? In the 70s, we were quite intrigued with how memory works. By we, I mean psychologists. I'm a recovering psychologist, but we were intrigued by how memory works, and we're seeking metaphors to understand memory. We have computer-laden language today because at this time, especially in the 70s, computer systems were becoming, trendy. And it was becoming more part of popular culture. The idea of the computer, hardware, software, garbage in, garbage out, processing and all of that. And so the language for forgetting, for memory, came from the study of computers. Now think about that for a moment. We, in normal parlance, create computers, which teach us how to think about cognition. Right? The computer systems teach us how to think about our own selves, right? So that in a sense, computers recreate us. In the self-same moment, we create them as tools or as embodiments of human cognition. I think in the same way, AI is misnamed. It's a misnomer. There's something hubristic about the idea of thinking, about the idea that these things, these large language models are artificial, and that we are the natural intelligences, and they are just artificial. What does it mean when we confront the very disturbing idea that human cognition might not be human after all, that we might have actually been sharing intelligence with technology and furniture and density and intensity and archetypes and ancestrality and spirituality and gastronomy and microbes around us. What does it mean to stay with that a little longer than we're used to?
Well, speaking of the creating the creator, I'm going to bring this conversation full circle back to you learning from your son.
Yes.
And our final question, for anyone who's listening to this, who is perhaps sitting there staring at the puzzle pieces of their life, of this moment, if there was one piece of wisdom that you had for them, what would it be?
The puzzle is not yours. It's not yours. We have labored under the impression that we have to put things together, that we are the owners of ourselves, that we are the owners of our own lives. My son taught me that I don't have to adhere to the prescriptions of the manufacturer, that I don't have to. And in so doing, offered wisdom that the puzzle is not ours. The puzzle is a playground that is already infiltrated by the things that we have longed to keep outside of modern civility. Our lives are already the playgrounds of microbes and monsters, of ancestrality, of algorithms, of software and hardware, of futures and stranger temporalities that Dan could fit on a linear time scale. And so maybe this is the time for listening to the others. Maybe selves are soulscapes. Maybe we have reduced the soul to the disembodied ghost that lives within our flesh. Maybe, like the etymology of the word soul suggests, the soul is the sea, and the sea is always populated by the others. Maybe our souls are strange and we haven't met them yet. Maybe the puzzle isn't ours.
And maybe the puzzle is the playground.
Yes.
Beautiful. I can't think of a more perfect place to end. Thank you so much, Bayo. I always receive so much from our conversations, and I can already feel the grooves in my mind forming.
Thank you, sister. As always, we do great together. Thank you.
At the end of each episode, I offer prompts for guided self-reflection to help internalize and investigate how this week's themes show up in our daily lives and how we can apply the principles discussed. For this week, I wanted to share a practice in my life that's related to what Bayo shared around the third way. Whenever we're faced with the decision, I've noticed that our minds tend to gravitate towards only two options. We tend to jump straight into this or that thinking. So instead, I'll invite you to ask yourself, what's the third option? In my life, I often find that the third option looks like something balanced between the two, or one that throws out the instructions altogether. So when you find yourself in a position of making a decision, ask yourself, what's the third option? The Nature Of is an Atmos podcast produced by Jesse Baker and Eric Newsom of Magnificent Noise. Our production staff includes Julia Nat, Eleanor Kagan, and Daniel Hartman. Our sound designer is Kristen Muller. The executive producers of The Nature Of are me, Willow Defebaugh, Teresa Perez, Jake Sargent, and Eric Newsom. Atmos is a nonprofit media organization focused on the cross-pollination of climate and culture. In addition to our podcast, we deliver award-winning journalism and creative storytelling through a biannual print magazine, daily digital features, original newsletters, and more. To support our work or this podcast, see our show notes or visit atmos.earth/biome. That's ATMOS.earth/biome. I'm your host, Willow Defebaugh, and this is The Nature of.